The church was so quiet, I could hear the fabric of my dress brushing against the pew as I shifted my weight. My daughter was reading her prepared eulogy, her voice catching in all the right places, and I watched my own funeral rehearsal from the back row where no one thought to look for me. That's when I noticed him, my husband of 32 years, checking his watch. Not once, 3 times in the span of Sarah's 2-minute speech. The same watch he'd checked right after the brakes failed on my car last month. The same watch he'd glanced at while the EMT was taking my pulse on the wet pavement. I remembered thinking then that he looked relieved when I opened my eyes. Now I understood he'd been disappointed. But let me back up. 3 months earlier, I was still living in what I thought was a perfectly ordinary life in Phoenix. The kind where you know your neighbor's dogs by name and the barista at the corner coffee shop starts making your vanilla latte the moment she sees your car pull into the lot. I had been married to Richard since I was 23, and together we'd built what everyone called a model family. Sarah was 30 now, working as a pharmaceutical sales rep, married to a decent enough man named Brad. We had Sunday dinners, we had traditions, we had what I believed was love. The first whisper I caught wasn't even meant for me to hear. I'd come home early from my book club because Margaret had canceled last minute. Her cat was sick. Which should have been my first warning that day because Margaret's cat had been dead for 2 years. I found Richard and Sarah in the kitchen, their heads bent together over my laptop, which was odd because I'd left it in my office upstairs. Sarah was saying something about accelerated timeline, and Richard was nodding. His reading glasses perched on his nose the way they always were when he was concentrating on something important. When I cleared my throat, they jumped apart like teenagers caught making out. Sarah's laugh came too quick, too bright. "Just looking at your photos, Mom," she said, but she'd closed the laptop so fast I heard the click of it shutting down. Richard kissed my cheek and asked about book club with the kind of focused attention that felt rehearsed. I told them about Margaret's cat, and Sarah didn't even blink at the impossibility of it. I stood there in my own kitchen, the afternoon light streaming through the windows I'd washed just that weekend, and felt something shift inside me. It was subtle, like the first tremor before an earthquake that you're not entirely sure you felt. Richard offered me tea, Earl Grey, my favorite, and his hands were steady as he filled the kettle. Too steady. Sarah pulled out her phone and started scrolling, her thumb moving in mechanical swipes that seemed designed to look casual. The normalcy of it all felt staged, like I'd walked onto a set where everyone knew their lines except me. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead I went to my office. The laptop was exactly where I'd left it that morning, next to my half-finished crossword puzzle and the mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. But the power cord was warm. Not hot, just warm enough to tell me it had been recently unplugged and moved. I touched the laptop itself, also warm. They'd been using it for a while before I came home. Long enough for the machine to heat up, long enough to do something they didn't want me to see. I know you're probably thinking I should have confronted them right then. But here's the thing about love that nobody tells you until you're drowning in it. It makes you an accomplice to your own destruction. I convinced myself I was imagining things. I convinced myself that my daughter and husband had every right to use my computer, to whisper in kitchens, to jump when I entered rooms. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. But that night I lay awake, cataloging all the small strange things I'd noticed over the past few months. The way Richard had started asking me if I'd remembered to take my vitamins each morning, something he'd never cared about before. The way Sarah had begun calling me every single day, always at the same time, always with the same question, "How are you feeling today, Mom?" As if she expected the answer to change, as if she was waiting for something. I thought about the new bottle of vitamins that had appeared in our medicine cabinet 3 weeks ago. Richard said my usual brand was out of stock, so he'd bought a different one. I'd been taking them faithfully every morning, because that's what you do when your husband of 3 decades buys you vitamins. You trust him. You take them. You don't question whether the pills inside match the label on the bottle. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay next to Richard in our king-sized bed with the duvet we'd bought together in Santa Fe on our 25th anniversary, and I listened to him breathe. He'd always been a loud sleeper, the kind of snoring that rattles paintings on walls. But that night he was silent, and somehow that was worse. I got up around 2 in the morning and went to my office, booted up my laptop. The search history had been cleared, which Richard never did, because he barely knew how to clear it. I felt something cold settle in my chest, something that tasted like metal and felt like falling. I tried to recover the deleted history using a trick my tech-savvy nephew had shown me years ago. It took me 20 minutes of fumbling through settings and menus, but eventually I found fragments. Searches for life insurance policies, accidental death benefits, how long before a new insurance policy pays out, symptoms of vitamin D toxicity. The searches were dated over the past 6 weeks, scattered between normal things like weather forecasts and news articles, but they were there, undeniable, damning. The next morning at breakfast, Sarah mentioned she'd be stopping by more often. "To spend time with you, Mom," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Her palm was clammy. I'd raised this girl, changed her diapers, stayed up with her through colic and nightmares and her first heartbreak. I knew when she was lying, and she was lying now. I just didn't know about what yet. I squeezed her hand back and watched her eyes. They flickered away from mine just for a second, but it was enough. I'd taught her to look people in the eye when she spoke to them. She'd been good at it as a child, disarmingly honest, those big brown eyes steady and clear. But somewhere between childhood and this moment, she'd learned to look away when she lied. Or maybe she'd always done it, and I'd just never wanted to see. Richard suggested we update our wills that weekend. Very casual, very practical. "We're not getting any younger, Diane," he said. And he was right. I was 55, he was 58. It made sense. Except we'd updated our wills 2 years ago, right after my mother passed away and left me her estate, a modest house in Scottsdale, and about $400,000 in savings and investments. I remember Richard had been particularly attentive during those months, bringing me tea, rubbing my shoulders, asking if I needed anything while I grieved. Now I wondered if that attention had been guilt or planning. Had he been kind because he loved me, or because he was already calculating how long he'd have to wait before my mother's money became his money? How long before I became an obstacle instead of a partner? I told him we could look at the wills later and watched something flicker across his face. Impatience, maybe, or calculation. I'd seen that look before when he was working through a difficult case at his law firm. The same expression he'd worn when he'd helped Mrs. Henderson down the street navigate her late husband's estate. Richard specialized in elder law, which I'd always thought was noble. He helped people protect themselves, protect their assets. At least that's what I'd believed. But elder law expertise meant he knew exactly how to exploit vulnerable adults. He knew which documents to forge, which signatures to fake, which medical claims would fly under the radar. He'd spent 30 years learning the system inside and out, and I'd been so proud of him for it. I'd bragged to my friends about how he helped seniors protect their life savings. It never occurred to me that he might use that same knowledge to steal mine. Have you ever had that moment where everything you thought you knew rearranges itself into a completely different picture? Like those optical illusions where you see a vase and then suddenly it's two faces looking at each other and you can't unsee it? That's what happened to me at the grocery store 3 days later. I was picking up ingredients for pot roast, Richard's favorite, when I overheard 2 women talking in the next aisle. One of them was describing how her mother's caregiver had stolen $35,300 in just 7 months. 35,000, she kept repeating, like the number itself was a betrayal. The other woman said something about how easy it is when the victim trusts you, when they think they need you. I stood there with a package of carrots in my hand and felt the world tilt. They needed me. That's what I'd been telling myself for years. Richard needed me to manage the house, to handle his dry cleaning, to remember his mother's birthday. Sarah needed me to babysit when her regular sitter fell through, to listen to her complaints about Brad, to loan her money that never quite got paid back. I was needed. I was necessary. And that belief had made me blind to everything else. But standing in that grocery store, Fluorescent lights humming overhead and elevator music playing some sanitized version of a song I used to love. I realized something horrifying. They didn't need me. They needed what I had. They needed my mother's estate, my life insurance, my share of the house we'd bought together when Sarah was still in diapers. They needed me to die, preferably in a way that would maximize their payout and minimize their suspicion. That night, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. I noticed how Sarah's visits always coincided with Richard being home. I noticed how they'd steer conversations toward my health. Was I sleeping okay? Was I feeling tired? Had I been forgetting things? I hadn't been forgetting anything, but they seemed determined to plant the idea that I was. I noticed the way Richard had started managing our finances differently, moving money around in ways he said were for tax purposes, but never quite explained in detail. I started keeping a journal, hidden in the back of my closet behind the winter coats I rarely wore in Phoenix's mild climate. I documented every strange conversation, every odd coincidence, every time they asked about my health or my plans or my finances. The journal filled up faster than I wanted it to, 20 pages in 2 weeks. Each page a small piece of evidence that the people I loved most were planning something terrible. I'd forgiven so much over the years. The times Richard came home late smelling like someone else's perfume, I forgave that, told myself it was just a colleague's hug at a retirement party. The times Sarah borrowed money and never mentioned it again, I forgave that, told myself she was struggling and what kind of mother keeps track. I forgave the small cruelties, the dismissive comments, the way they sometimes talked over me at dinner like I wasn't there. I convinced myself that forgiveness was love, that overlooking flaws was what family did. But forgiveness had cost me more than I'd realized. It had cost me boundaries. It had cost me the ability to see clearly. It had cost me myself. I read somewhere that 1 in 5 nursing home residents experience neglect at least once per year. I wasn't in a nursing home, but I was being neglected right there in my own kitchen, at my own table, in my own life. Neglect doesn't always look like abandonment. Sometimes it looks like people who are very, very present, but present for all the wrong reasons. The Sunday morning, everything changed. I was looking through old photo albums. We were planning a family event, Sarah's birthday dinner, and I wanted to find some childhood photos to display. I pulled out the album from the year she turned 8, that gap-toothed smile and scraped knees summer, and something slipped out from between the pages. At first, I thought it was just an old receipt, but when I picked it up, I saw it was a medical claim form. My medical claim form. For a prescription I'd never taken, from a doctor I'd never seen. My hands started shaking. I flipped through the rest of the album and found 3 more. All different doctors, all prescriptions I'd never heard of, all with my forged signature. I checked the dates. They'd been filed over the past 18 months. I went to my office, dug through my files, and found the explanation of benefit statements I'd been filing away without really reading. The insurance company had been paying out thousands of dollars for treatments I'd never received. I spread the documents across my desk like a detective laying out evidence. Each one represented money stolen, trust betrayed, my identity used as a tool for theft. The handwriting on the signatures was close to mine, but not quite right. The D in Diane leaned too far forward. The loop in the final E was too small. These were tracings or copies, done by someone who'd studied my signature, but couldn't quite replicate the muscle memory of it. This wasn't forgetfulness on my part. This wasn't coincidence. This was systematic fraud, and the signatures on these forms looked enough like mine to fool an insurance company, but not me. I'd signed my name thousands of times. I knew its particular slant, the way my D looped back on itself. These signatures were close, but they were copies. Bad copies. I sat at my desk until the sun went down, just staring at those papers, and something in me went cold and clear. All the little moments suddenly made sense. The whispered conversations, the sudden interest in my health, the suggestions that maybe I should see a new doctor, that maybe I should consider updating my insurance beneficiaries, They weren't worried about me. They were worried about getting caught. And then I did something I'm not particularly proud of, but desperation makes you practical. I took photos of every document. I uploaded them to a cloud storage account Richard didn't know I had, one I'd set up years ago for my book club's shared reading lists. Then I carefully put everything back exactly where I'd found it. If they knew I'd discovered their fraud, they might accelerate whatever they were planning. Better to let them think they were still in control while I figured out my next move. That night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, really looked, and I didn't recognize who was staring back at me. She had shadows under her eyes like bruises. Her mouth was set in a line that suggested she'd forgotten how to smile naturally. Her hair needed cutting, but she'd been too busy taking care of everyone else to take care of herself. She looked like someone who'd been slowly erased, and the worst part was she'd helped with the eraser. I thought about calling the police right then. I thought about confronting Richard and Sarah that night, but something stopped me. Maybe it was 32 years of being trained to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to put family first. Or maybe it was something smarter, some instinct for self-preservation that I'd almost lost, but not quite. I needed proof. I needed to understand the full scope of what they'd done before I made my move. The next morning, I called my old friend Patricia from college. We'd lost touch over the years. Richard had never particularly liked her, said she was too pushy, too opinionated. But I remembered she'd become a faith counselor, working with people in crisis. I told her I needed to talk, and she invited me to her office in downtown Phoenix that same afternoon. Patricia's office was in an older building with high ceilings and windows that actually opened, a rarity in modern Phoenix where everything was sealed tight against the heat. The space smelled like lavender and old books, and when she hugged me, I almost broke down right there. She made tea, settled me in a comfortable chair by the window, and waited. She didn't push or prod, just waited with the kind of patient silence that made you want to fill it with truth. I started talking and couldn't stop. Everything poured out, the whispers, the forged medical claims, the way Richard had been subtly isolating me from friends, the way Sarah's visits felt more like surveillance than daughterly concern. The words tumbled over each other, 3 months of suspicion and fear and heartbreak condensed into 20 minutes of breathless confession. Patricia listened to all of it, her face growing more serious with each revelation. But she never interrupted, never told me I was imagining things or being dramatic. When I finally ran out of words, my tea had gone cold and the afternoon light had shifted across the floor. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her own mug, steam rising between us like a curtain. Then she said something that changed everything. "Diane, I was just reading an article about elder abuse. Did you know it's often family members who are the perpetrators? They use their access, their knowledge of your routines and finances, to exploit you. And the victims often don't report it because they don't want to believe their own family could do this to them." The words elder abuse hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't elderly. I was 55, healthy, active. I went to yoga twice a week. I volunteered at the library. I could still run a mile without stopping, albeit slowly. But Patricia pulled up the article on her computer, and there it was. Elder abuse could affect anyone over 50, and financial exploitation was one of the most common forms. The profile of typical victims could have been written about me: trusting, conflict avoidant, wanting to believe the best of their family, making excuses for suspicious behavior. Patricia asked if she could help me document what was happening, and I said yes. That yes felt like the first honest word I'd spoken in months. She suggested I start gathering evidence, quietly and carefully. She gave me the number of a lawyer who specialized in financial fraud and a therapist who worked with abuse victims. She didn't use the word victim lightly, and neither did I accept it easily. But there it was, the truth I'd been running from. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. I was being systematically exploited by the two people I'd loved most in this world. I became a detective in my own life. I started screenshotting bank statements before Richard could close the laptop. I set up a small recording device in the kitchen. It was my house too, so legally I was allowed, and captured conversations that would have seemed innocent to anyone who didn't know what they were really discussing. Richard talking to Sarah about timeline adjustments. Sarah mentioning something about Phase 2. Richard laughing about how easy it had been to redirect funds without me noticing. The recording that finally broke me was from a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah had stopped by while Richard was at work, which was unusual. She'd asked me how I was feeling, if I'd been dizzy lately, if I'd had any chest pains. I said no, I felt fine. Why was she asking? And she'd said, in this sad, concerned voice, that sometimes people don't notice symptoms until it's too late. That I should really see a doctor just to be safe. That she worried about me. I'd hugged her, grateful for her concern, feeling guilty that I'd suspected her of anything sinister. She was my daughter. She was worried about me. That was natural, wasn't it? But after she left, I played back the recording from earlier that morning when she'd called Richard. I heard her say, "She's not cooperating with the health narrative. We might need to accelerate." And Richard had responded, "The accident would be cleaner, but we have to wait for the right moment. The policy hasn't matured yet." I must have played that recording 20 times, sitting alone in my kitchen, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, everything looking so normal and ordinary while the words coming through my headphones described my planned murder. The accident, the policy. Each time I hoped I'd hear something different, some context that would make it innocent. But there was no innocent context for those words. The accident would be cleaner. They were going to stage an accident. They were going to kill me and make it look unintentional. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work my phone, but I managed to send the audio file to my secure cloud storage, then to Patricia, then to the lawyer she'd recommended. Evidence. I needed all the evidence I could gather. I went to Richard's office, his real office, the one he thought I never entered, and found the life insurance policy he'd taken out on me 6 months ago. $2 million, double indemnity for accidental death. I'd never signed it, but there was my signature, or something close enough to it. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the papers. $4 million if I died in an accident. 4 million reasons for Richard and Sarah to cut my brake lines, or push me down the stairs, or arrange some other tragic mishap. I thought about all the times recently that Sarah had suggested we go hiking together, just the two of us, on trails I'd never heard of. I thought about Richard's insistence that I should drive to visit my cousin in Flagstaff, alone, even though the route was mountainous and he knew I didn't like mountain driving. Every suggestion, every invitation, every casual recommendation now seemed like a potential murder attempt that I'd narrowly avoided through sheer luck or stubbornness. They were planning to kill me. My husband and my daughter were planning to kill me and make it look like an accident. This wasn't just financial fraud. This was premeditated murder, wrapped up in family dinners and I love yous and kisses on the cheek. I made copies of everything that night. The fraudulent medical claims, the forged life insurance policy, the recorded conversations, bank statements showing money being siphoned from our joint accounts into accounts I didn't have access to. I created a digital folder and backed it up in 3 different places: the cloud, a USB drive I kept in my gym bag, and an external hard drive I mailed to Patricia for safekeeping. Then I called Patricia and told her what I'd found. She said something I'll never forget. "Diane, you need to disappear before you confront them. They're desperate now, and desperate people do desperate things." But I didn't disappear fast enough. 4 days later, my brakes failed. I was driving home from the library in the afternoon, the sun bright and hot the way it gets in Phoenix in late spring, and when I went to slow down for the red light at Camelback and 32nd Street, nothing happened. The pedal went straight to the floor. I pumped it once, twice, my heart hammering, and then I was sailing through the intersection. I remember screaming. I remember the sound of horns. I remember yanking the emergency brake and feeling the car spin, the world rotating in a sick circle, and then the impact of hitting a light pole. The airbag deployed with a sound like a gunshot, and suddenly my face was buried in white fabric that smelled like chemicals and burnt plastic. I tasted blood and dust. My head was ringing, and there were people shouting and someone was calling 911. For a moment, I just sat there, stunned, trying to understand that I was alive. I'd gone through that intersection at 40 miles an hour with no brakes. I should have hit another car, should have been broadsided, should have died exactly the way they'd planned. But somehow, impossibly, I'd only hit a light pole and the airbag had done its job. I managed to unbuckle myself, push open the door, stumble out onto the hot pavement. My legs were shaking. A woman in a business suit was asking if I was okay, her face pale with concern. A man was directing traffic around my crumpled car. Someone else was talking on their phone, giving the intersection address to emergency services. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. The EMT arrived within minutes. He was young, looked about Sarah's age, and he kept asking me questions. What day was it? Did I know my name? Could I follow his finger with my eyes? I answered everything correctly. Tuesday. Diane. Yes, I can follow your finger. I was bruised and shaken, but miraculously uninjured. He checked my pupils, my pulse, asked if anything hurt. My chest from the seatbelt, I told him, my wrists from gripping the steering wheel, but nothing broken, nothing serious. That's when I saw Richard running toward me across the intersection. Someone must have called him, probably the police, since I was in his car, registered in both our names. He was breathless, his tie loosened, and when he reached me, he grabbed my shoulders and looked into my eyes with what anyone else would have called concern. But I was watching his hands, and I saw the moment one of them drifted to my wrist, felt for my pulse. His face when he found it, when he confirmed I was alive, that face told me everything. There was disappointment there, barely concealed, quickly smoothed over, but there. "Honey, are you all right?" he asked, and his voice was perfect. Worried husband, scared for his wife. But his eyes were doing calculations. "How did you survive?" they asked. "How did this fail? What do we do now?" He checked his watch. The same Rolex I'd given him for his 50th birthday, saved up for months to afford it, presented it to him over dinner at the restaurant where he'd proposed. And in that moment, lying on the pavement with strangers fussing over me and my husband checking to see if his murder attempt had worked, I made a decision. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to disappear. I was going to make them pay for every lie, every forged signature, every whispered plan. "I'm okay," I told him, and I meant it. For the first time in months, I was okay. I knew exactly what they'd done, and I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. The fear I'd been carrying crystallized into something harder, colder, determination, rage, the promise of justice. The mechanic's report came back 3 days later. Brake line had been cut, deliberately and cleanly, not worn through, not corroded. Cut. The mechanic showed me the line, the edges too precise to be anything but intentional. Someone with basic mechanical knowledge could have done it in under 10 minutes, he said. Pop the hood, reach in with wire cutters, snip the line where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Then it's just a matter of time until the brake fluid leaks out completely and the driver has no way to stop. I filed a police report. I gave them copies of everything I'd gathered, the forged documents, the recordings, the insurance policy I'd never signed. The detective assigned to my case was a woman in her 40s named Rodriguez, who listened to everything with an expression that grew progressively grimmer. She asked if I felt safe at home. I lied and said yes, because I knew that if I moved out or asked Richard to leave, they'd know I was onto them. Better to let them think their plan had simply failed, but could be tried again. And then I did something they would never expect. I went home and acted like nothing had happened. Well, nothing except a scary accident that I was so grateful to have survived. I thanked Richard for coming so quickly to the scene. I let Sarah fuss over me, bring me soup, fluff my pillows. I played the role of the shaken but resilient wife and mother, while inside I was made of ice and rage and perfect clarity. I needed them to think they'd failed, but could try again. I needed them to make another move, one the police could catch in real time. So I went about my life as normally as I could, except I was never truly alone. Patricia had helped me hire a private investigator who documented everything, every visit Sarah made, every phone call Richard took in his office, every suspicious movement in our bank accounts. My lawyer had already filed preliminary paperwork for fraud charges. The police were monitoring our phones and bank accounts with my full permission and cooperation. I was bait in a trap of my own design, and for the first time in years, I felt powerful. Detective Rodriguez called me every few days to check in, always when Richard was at work. She'd ask if anything unusual had happened, if they'd said or done anything suspicious. I'd report every detail, the way Richard had suggested I should probably drive less after the accident, maybe let him handle all the errands, the way Sarah had recommended a new doctor who specialized in treating trauma, someone she knew personally who could see me right away. Every suggestion designed to isolate me, control me, make me more vulnerable to their next attempt. It was Sarah who suggested the funeral rehearsal. She framed it as a practical thing, something to ease the burden on survivors when the time came. We could pick out my casket, choose readings, decide on flowers. That way, she said, when something happens to you, and here she'd paused, corrected herself, if something happens to you, we'll be prepared. Richard had agreed immediately, saying it was very thoughtful of Sarah to think ahead like this. Practical, considerate, the kind of thing a loving family does. I'd hesitated just long enough to seem reluctant, but not suspicious. And then I'd said yes. Inside, I was thinking about how bold they'd become. Planning my funeral while I was still alive, still a problem, still standing between them and my money. The audacity of it was almost impressive. Almost. The funeral home was called Eternal Gardens, which I'd always thought was a terrible name because gardens are alive and funerals are very much about death. The director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Chen, treated me with the careful kindness usually reserved for people who are already dead. He showed us casket options, bronze, cherry wood, simple pine. Sarah kept gravitating toward the expensive ones, her fingers trailing over the polished wood, and Richard kept nodding along. "For you, Mom," Sarah said, squeezing my hand. "You deserve the best." I wanted to laugh at that. The best casket, bought with insurance money they'd get from murdering me, picked out while I stood right there breathing and watching. But I just smiled and said something about how I didn't think it mattered much. I wouldn't be around to appreciate it. Sarah had frowned at that, like I was being difficult about my own funeral. "We want this to be nice, Mom. We want to honor you properly." We picked out flowers, white roses, which I'd always hated but Sarah loved. I'd told her a dozen times over the years that I preferred wildflowers, something natural and unstructured, but she'd apparently forgotten or didn't care. Richard suggested lilies too, said they were classic. Between the two of them, they designed my funeral with all my least favorite things, and I agreed to every choice. Sure, white roses, lilies, whatever you think is best. We chose readings, Psalm 23, that one about green pastures and still waters. I suggested maybe something less traditional, maybe a poem I loved by Mary Oliver about the wild geese, but Sarah had actually snapped at me. "Mom, this is serious. We need to do this right." Right for whom, I'd wanted to ask, but I bit my tongue. Let them plan it their way. Let them think they were in control. Soon enough, they'd understand they'd been wrong about everything. The rehearsal itself was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Appropriate, I thought, since Thursday had always been my least favorite day of the week. Neither here nor there, just waiting for Friday. Mr. Chen explained that we'd run through the whole service as if I were actually deceased. It would help everyone know what to expect, where to stand, when to speak. I asked if I should attend, and Sarah had looked at me like I was crazy. "Of course you should attend, Mom. You need to approve everything." So on Thursday afternoon, I put on a navy dress, funeral appropriate, I thought darkly, and drove to Eternal Gardens. Detective Rodriguez had been briefed on what was happening. My lawyer knew. Patricia knew. The private investigator was parked across the street with cameras ready. I'd wired myself with a recording device so small it was almost invisible. This rehearsal would be documented from every angle. So there I was, sitting in the back pew of the funeral home's chapel, watching my daughter deliver a eulogy about what a wonderful mother I'd been. Past tense. She stood at the podium in a black dress, her hair pulled back, her face arranged in an expression of grief. Richard sat in the front row, his shoulders set in a posture of sorrow he'd probably been practicing in the mirror. Sarah's voice wavered at all the right moments. She talked about my kindness, my sacrifice, how I'd always put family first. She mentioned the time I'd stayed up all night when she had pneumonia at age 7, holding her while she coughed, singing her favorite songs. She talked about how I'd taught her to bake cookies, how we'd had a tradition of making Christmas cutouts every December, decorating them with too much frosting and sprinkles. She described me as selfless, devoted, the kind of mother every child deserved. Every word was true, and every word was a lie because she was saying them while planning to make them necessary. The cookies were real. The pneumonia vigil was real. My love for her had been real. But everything she was saying existed in a past she'd already decided to end. I wasn't a person to her anymore. I was an obstacle, a source of money, a problem to be solved. That's when I noticed Richard checking his watch. Once, twice, 3 times during Sarah's 2-minute speech. The same watch he'd checked on the pavement after the brakes failed. The same watch he'd glanced at in the kitchen when they were discussing timelines. I realized he was calculating. How much longer until the policy matured? How much longer until they could try again? How much longer until I was actually dead instead of just rehearsing it? Mr. Chen was nodding along, taking notes on which parts of the eulogy were most effective. Sarah finished and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though I saw no actual tears. Richard stood and approached the podium for his portion. My husband of 32 years, about to deliver remarks about our life together at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. He talked about how we'd met at a college party, how I'd been wearing a yellow dress and laughing at something a friend said, how he'd known from that first moment that I was special. He talked about our wedding day, about building our life together, about the birth of our daughter. His voice was steady, controlled, appropriately emotional. He mentioned my love of books, my volunteer work, my devotion to family. He said I'd made him a better man. I sat in the back pew, listening to him rewrite our history. The yellow dress had been green. We'd met at the library, not a party. He'd asked me for help finding a book on contract law, and we'd ended up talking for 2 hours. Those were small lies, probably not even conscious ones. Memory is faulty, and 32 years is a long time. But the bigger lie was the whole performance. The devoted husband act. The grief he was trying on like a suit to see if it fit. Sarah finished her eulogy, and Mr. Chen nodded approvingly. "That was beautiful," he said. "Very moving. Would you like to hear the musical selections now?" But I stood up from my back pew and walked down the aisle toward them, and the look on their faces when they saw me approaching was almost worth everything they'd put me through. Richard's eyes widened. Sarah's mouth opened slightly. For a moment, they'd forgotten I was there. For a moment, they'd been so immersed in the fantasy of my death that my living, breathing presence was a shock. Good. Let them be shocked. Let them be scared. They had no idea what was coming. "I'd like to add something to the service," I said. My voice echoed in the small chapel, stronger than I'd heard it in months. "I'd like to play a recording." Mr. Chen looked confused. "A recording of what, Mrs. Matthews? Music? A message?" "Not music," I said. I pulled out my phone, connected it to the chapel's sound system. Mr. Chen had shown us how earlier when discussing the musical selections. Richard had gone very still. Sarah's mouth was opening and closing like a fish. I pressed play. The recording started with Sarah's voice, tinny through the speakers but perfectly audible. She's not cooperating with the health narrative. We might need to accelerate. Then Richard. The accident would be cleaner, but we have to wait for the right moment. The policy hasn't matured yet. The color drained from Sarah's face. Richard stood frozen at the podium, his hands gripping the edges like he might fall. Mr. Chen looked from the speakers to me to them, clearly trying to understand what he was hearing. I let it play for 30 seconds, their voices filling the chapel with talk of timelines and accidents and policies, and then I stopped it. There's more, I said. Hours more. Conversations about forging medical claims, discussions about the brake line on my car, the one that was cut 4 weeks ago, nearly killing me. Plans for making my death look natural or accidental, whichever was more convenient. The police have copies of everything. So does my lawyer. So does the insurance company whose money you've been stealing using my forged signature. Sarah started crying, real tears this time. But they weren't for me. They were for herself, for the future she'd just watched collapse. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "Mom, please. It's not what it sounds like. We can explain." "Don't," I said, and the word came out sharp as glass. "Don't you dare try to explain or justify or apologize. You checked my pulse after you tried to kill me, Richard. You checked your watch during my funeral rehearsal. You've stolen my money, forged my signature, and plotted my murder. There is nothing you can say that I want to hear." Richard tried to speak, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Diane, you're clearly upset. You're confused. Let's go home and talk about this calmly." But his voice was shaking. His hands were shaking. He knew he was caught. He knew every word that had just played was damning and recorded and already in the hands of authorities. Mr. Chen had backed away toward his office, probably to call security or the police or both, but he didn't need to. The funeral home doors opened and 2 police officers walked in, right on cue. Detective Rodriguez was with them, her badge clipped to her belt, her expression professional and cold. Patricia had been waiting in her car in the parking lot, ready to make the call the moment I gave the signal, a text message I'd sent as soon as the recording finished playing. "Richard Matthews, Sarah Collins." Detective Rodriguez said, "You're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and identity theft." Officers moved forward with handcuffs, reading them their rights in voices that had done this 1,000 times before. Richard made a move toward me and I stepped back. An officer intercepted him, turning him around, pulling his hands behind his back. Sarah was already crying harder, asking how I could do this to my own daughter. How could I do this to her? As if I was the one who'd committed the crime. As if I was the one who'd betrayed every bond of love and trust. "Because you tried to kill me," I said quietly. "Because you've been stealing from me for months, maybe years. Because you cut my brake lines. Because you forged insurance documents. Because every time you hugged me or told me you loved me, you were planning my murder." "That's not true," Sarah sobbed. "Dad said we were just protecting ourselves. He said you were sick, that you were going to waste all the money, that we deserved it. It was his idea, not mine. I just went along with it." She was already turning on him, already trying to save herself. Richard's face went hard. "Don't say another word," he told her. "Not without a lawyer present." But Sarah wasn't listening, the words pouring out between sobs about how he'd convinced her, manipulated her, told her it was the only way. The officers led them out separately. Richard went first, his head high, already calculating his defense. Sarah went next, still crying, still trying to explain to anyone who would listen that it wasn't her fault, that she'd been influenced, that she was sorry. I watched them being led away and felt absolutely nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not even sadness. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where love used to be. Mr. Chen approached me carefully after they were gone, like I might shatter. "Mrs. Matthews, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. If I'd known what they were planning." He trailed off, clearly shaken. "It's not your fault," I told him, "and I'd like to cancel the funeral arrangements, obviously. He nodded quickly. Of course, of course. I'll tear up the contracts immediately. No charge. Detective Rodriguez stayed after the patrol officers left with Richard and Sarah. She asked if I was okay, if I needed anything. I shook my head. I'm fine, I said, and I was. For the first time in months, I was fine. This part is over, Rodriguez said. The investigation, the trial, that'll take months, maybe over a year. But you did the hard part. You survived and you got the evidence we needed to put them away. I thanked her and Patricia, who'd come in from the parking lot. They'd both been crucial to this moment, to my survival, to justice. Without them, I might have ended up in one of Mr. Chen's caskets for real. Instead, I was walking out of Eternal Gardens alive, free, and surrounded by people who actually cared whether I lived or died. Everything after that happened very fast and very slow at the same time. Richard was read his rights. Sarah was handcuffed, still crying, still asking how I could do this to my own daughter. I watched them being led away and felt absolutely nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not even sadness. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where love used to be. The investigation took months. They found everything, the forged documents, the siphoned money, the cut brake line, emails between Richard and Sarah discussing how to stage my death to maximize their payout. Richard's law expertise had actually worked against him because he'd been meticulous about planning, which meant he'd left a meticulous paper trail. Sarah had kept notes on her phone about which of my medications could be replaced with something harmful without me noticing. They'd thought of everything except the possibility that I might think of things too. The trial was public and brutal. The local news picked up the story. Phoenix lawyer and daughter accused of murder-for-hire plot. Our neighbors who'd always thought we were such a nice family were interviewed, expressing shock and disbelief. Richard's colleagues released statements about his character, though those became more cautious as the evidence mounted. Sarah's friends defended her on social media until the prosecution released the recordings and the text messages and the detailed notes about how to poison me without it being detectable. The evidence was overwhelming. Richard's paralegal testified about suspicious documents she'd been asked to notarize without meeting me in person. My insurance company's fraud investigator detailed the pattern of false claims. The mechanic who'd examined my car after the accident explained how the brake line had been precisely cut. Detective Rodriguez walked the jury through months of recorded phone calls and bank statements. Richard's defense tried to paint me as a vengeful wife, angry about his affairs, fabricating evidence to destroy him. But they couldn't explain away my signatures on documents I'd never signed. They couldn't explain the cut brake line. They couldn't explain the recorded conversations where Richard and Sarah explicitly discussed killing me. The defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. Sarah's lawyer tried a different approach. She was a victim too, manipulated by her father, coerced into participating. She'd kept notes about poisons because she was afraid, documenting what he was planning so she could prove it later. It was a creative argument, but the prosecution had recordings of Sarah initiating conversations about my death. She hadn't been coerced. She'd been an enthusiastic participant. Richard lost his law license before he lost his freedom. The state bar doesn't look kindly on attorneys who use their expertise to commit fraud and attempted murder. He lost access to our joint accounts, our house, everything we'd built together. It all became mine, because it had always been mine. I just hadn't realized he'd been treating it like his piggy bank for years. The forensic accountant testified that Richard had siphoned over $200,000 from our accounts over the past 3 years. Money that should have been building our retirement, paying down our mortgage, funding the life we'd planned together. Instead, he'd been moving it into offshore accounts, preparing for a future where I wouldn't be around to ask questions. Sarah lost her job when her employer found out about the arrest. Brad filed for divorce within weeks, releasing a statement about how shocked and betrayed he felt. He testified at the trial that Sarah had been withdrawn and secretive in recent months, taking calls in private, spending hours texting someone. He'd thought she was having an affair. The truth was worse. She lost her friends, her reputation, the future she'd been planning with my money. The irony was that if she'd just waited, if she'd let me live and die naturally, she would have inherited everything eventually anyway. My will left her everything, the house, the savings, my mother's estate. All of it would have been hers in time. But greed makes people stupid, and murder plots make them stupider. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts on all counts: fraud, attempted murder, conspiracy. The foreman read the verdict with a voice devoid of emotion, but I saw some of the jurors looking at Richard and Sarah with disgust. One older woman was crying. This could have been her family, her daughter, her son-in-law. The betrayal was universal and personal all at once. Richard got 25 years, Sarah got 18, her sentence slightly reduced because the judge accepted that Richard had been the primary architect of the scheme. They'll both be old when they get out, if they get out. Older than I am now. Old enough to understand what they stole from themselves when they tried to steal my life. The courtroom was packed for sentencing. I sat in the front row this time, not the back. I wanted them to see me when the judge handed down their sentences. I wanted to be the last face they saw as free people. Sarah turned around before the bailiffs led her away, and for just a second, our eyes met. I saw her mouth move. Sorry, Mom. But I looked away. Some betrayals are too deep for sorry to reach. After it was over, after the news vans left and the reporters stopped calling, I stood in the empty house Richard and I had shared for 3 decades, and I didn't cry. I walked through rooms full of memories that had all been rewritten by what I now knew. That anniversary trip to Santa Fe where we'd bought the duvet. Richard had been having an affair with his paralegal the whole time, charging expensive dinners to our credit card while telling me he was working late. That Christmas when Sarah gave me a beautiful locket, she'd bought it with money she'd stolen from my mother's estate, money that should have been saved or invested or at least spent honestly. Every happy memory had rot at its core. Every I love you had been conditional. Every hug had been calculation. I couldn't separate the real from the fake anymore, so I decided to let it all go. I could have stayed in that house, but it felt like living in a mausoleum. Instead, I sold it, sold almost everything in it, and moved to a small condo in Tempe with a view of the mountains. I kept only what was mine alone: my books, my mother's jewelry, photographs from before I met Richard. Everything else went to charity or auction. Let someone else make new memories with that furniture, those dishes, that bed where I'd slept beside a man who was planning my murder. The money from the house, combined with what I recovered of my mother's estate and the insurance settlement I received after suing the company Richard and Sarah had defrauded, left me more comfortable than I'd ever been. Ironic that their plot to steal my money ended up making me wealthier. The insurance company had paid out thousands on fraudulent claims, and when I sued them for negligence in not catching the obvious fraud, they settled quickly to avoid publicity. I could have retired, traveled, done nothing but heal. And maybe I would have if it weren't for the letters. They started arriving about 6 months after the trial. Letters from strangers who'd seen my story on the news. Women mostly, though not always. People who recognized themselves in what had happened to me. Someone whose son had been stealing their disability checks for years, guilt-tripping them into silence by saying he needed it more. Someone whose sister had taken out credit cards in their name, running up tens of thousands in debt while claiming it was all a misunderstanding. Someone whose spouse had been slowly poisoning them while pretending to manage their diabetes, substituting vitamins for insulin, hoping for a quiet death that wouldn't raise suspicion. The letters were heartbreaking and infuriating, and they all said some version of the same thing. I thought I was alone. I thought no one would believe me. I didn't know this had a name. I didn't know I could fight back. That's when I found my purpose. Patricia connected me with a local agency that worked with elder abuse victims. I started volunteering, just a few hours a week at first. I'd sit with people who were going through what I'd been through, and I'd tell them, "You're not crazy. You're not imagining it. What they're doing to you has a name, and it's illegal, and you deserve better." Some of them were elderly in the traditional sense. 80s, 90s, living in assisted care facilities where staff or family members were exploiting them. But others were like me, 50s, 60s, active and healthy, but being systematically robbed by people they trusted. The common thread wasn't age or ability. It was trust being weaponized against them. The agency asked if I'd be willing to share my story more publicly to help raise awareness. I said yes. I spoke at community centers, at senior centers, at churches and synagogues, and anywhere people would listen. I talked about the warning signs I'd missed, the isolation, the financial control, the gaslighting about my health and memory, the way financial abuse often escalates to physical danger, the importance of maintaining your own accounts, your own relationships, your own identity, no matter how much you love someone. I lobbied for stronger elder abuse laws in Arizona. I testified before the state legislature about the gaps in protection, the difficulty of prosecution, the need for better oversight of financial institutions and healthcare providers. I helped launch an education campaign about financial exploitation, working with banks to train tellers to recognize warning signs. And slowly, very slowly, I began to heal. Not because of justice, though the guilty verdicts helped, but because I was taking my pain and transforming it into protection for others. Every person I helped, every law that changed, every awareness campaign that reached someone who needed it, that was my healing. That was how I took back what Richard and Sarah had tried to steal. I made new friends, real friends who knew me as Diane and not as Richard's wife or Sarah's mother. I took classes at the community college, art history, creative writing, things I'd always wanted to study but never had time for when I was busy being the perfect wife and mother. I adopted a dog from the shelter, a scrappy terrier mix named Luna, who had also survived betrayal. Her previous owner had surrendered her when she got too old and too expensive. We were two survivors learning to trust again, and we did it together. I learned to live alone without being lonely. My condo was small, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture I chose, every picture I hung, every decision was mine alone. No one to please, no one to serve, no one secretly plotting against me. The freedom was disorienting at first, like being released from a cage I hadn't known I was in. But gradually, I learned to spread my wings. The first year was the hardest, holidays especially. Thanksgiving came, and I had nowhere to go, no one to cook for. I'd always hosted, always spent days preparing the perfect meal. That first Thanksgiving alone, I made a sandwich and cried. Christmas was worse. I'd always been the one who decorated the tree, wrapped the gifts, made everything magical. That first Christmas after the trial, I almost didn't celebrate at all. But Patricia invited me to her house, and her loud, chaotic, genuine family absorbed me like I'd always belonged there. Her grandchildren made me ornaments. Her daughter-in-law taught me a recipe for tamales. Her husband told terrible jokes that made everyone groan but also laugh. It wasn't the picture-perfect holiday I'd always tried to create with Richard and Sarah. It was messy and loud and real. And it was the best Christmas I'd had in years because every hug was genuine, every laugh was honest, every moment was free from hidden agendas. By the second year, I was hosting my own Thanksgivings. I invited other volunteers from the agency, people I'd met through my advocacy work, friends from my classes. We were all refugees from broken families in one way or another, and we made our own tradition. Everyone brought something: food, stories, gratitude for second chances. Some were survivors of abuse, some were simply alone. But we came together and created family from choice instead of obligation. It wasn't the family I'd imagined having when I was 23 and marrying Richard, but it was real in a way my old family never had been. These people showed up because they wanted to, not because they were waiting for me to die so they could inherit. They listened because they cared, not because they were monitoring my mental state for their legal purposes. They loved me for who I was, not what I had. I started dating again, which felt strange at first. I'd been with Richard since I was barely more than a girl. I didn't know how to flirt or how to read modern dating signals. My first few attempts were disasters. One man spent the entire dinner talking about his ex-wife. Another was clearly only interested in whether I owned my condo outright. But then I met Tom at a community garden where I'd started volunteering. He was a widower, 15 years my senior, with kind eyes and dirt under his fingernails. We bonded over heirloom tomatoes and the shared understanding that love the second time around comes with scars. He told me about his wife who'd died of cancer 3 years prior, about nursing her through the final months, about the grief that still caught him by surprise sometimes. I told him about Richard and Sarah, about the trial, about learning to trust again. We took it slow. Coffee, then lunch, then dinner. Walks with Luna, who adored him immediately. Long conversations about our past lives, our mistakes, our hopes for whatever time we had left. He never pushed, never presumed. When he finally kissed me, 6 months into our friendship, it felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before, safe and new at the same time. Tom didn't try to fix me or save me. He just existed alongside me, tending his garden and his grief, and occasionally sharing both. We never moved in together. I needed my space, my independence too much, and he understood that. But we spent most evenings together, cooking, reading, watching old movies. The quiet domestic contentment I'd thought I had with Richard but had actually been performing. With Tom, I could just be. 3 years after the trial, I got a letter from Sarah. She'd been approved for some kind of rehabilitation program in prison, and part of it involved making amends. The letter was 3 pages long, single-spaced, and I could tell she'd rewritten it multiple times because the handwriting changed throughout, getting shakier and more desperate as it went on. She was sorry. She was ashamed. She'd been influenced by Richard, manipulated. She'd never meant for it to go so far. She hoped someday I could forgive her. She wanted me to know that she thought about me every day, that she regretted everything, that she understood if I never wanted to see her again, but she had to try to reach out anyway. I read the letter once, sitting at my kitchen table with Luna at my feet and afternoon light streaming through the windows. I read it and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no softening toward her. Just a distant recognition that the person who wrote this letter was a stranger who happened to share DNA with me. I put the letter in a drawer. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't respond either. Maybe someday I would. Maybe someday the anger would fade enough for me to see her as the daughter I'd raised, instead of the woman who'd tried to kill me. But that day hadn't come yet, and I was okay with that. Forgiveness isn't something you owe people. It's something you give yourself when you're ready, if you're ever ready. Richard never wrote. I heard through the prison grapevine, because there is always a grapevine, even from the outside, that he'd become something of a pariah inside. Even criminals have standards, apparently, and trying to murder your wife for insurance money violates them. He'd been attacked twice, spent time in solitary for his own protection. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction at that news. The larger part felt nothing at all. He'd become irrelevant to my life, a chapter I'd closed and locked away. The trial and its aftermath taught me something important about justice. People think it's supposed to feel good, like a weight lifted or a wrong righted. They expect violins and closure and a sense of peace. But real justice is messier than that. Richard and Sarah were punished. They lost their freedom, their reputations, their futures. I won in every legal sense. But victory didn't erase what they'd done or return the years I'd wasted believing their lies. Justice gave me closure, not healing. Healing I had to do myself, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of trust rebuilt at a time. Now, when I speak to other victims, I'm honest about that distinction. I tell them yes, report it, document everything, press charges if you can. Make them face consequences, but don't expect those consequences to fix you. Don't expect a guilty verdict to make you whole again. That work is separate and harder, and it's yours alone to do. Justice is external. Healing is internal. You need both, but they're not the same thing. I also learned that family isn't who shares your blood. It's who shows up when blood relatives are trying to drain yours. Patricia, who barely knew me when I reached out for help, but became my advocate and my friend. Tom, who'd loved and lost and learned to love again, who held space for my trauma without trying to fix it. The women at the agency who shared their stories and their strength, who let me help them and helped me in return. Luna, who greeted me with enthusiasm every single day regardless of what that day brought, who needed me as much as I needed her. These were my family now, chosen and cherished and real. They'd never inherit my money, but they'd inherit my story. They'd carry forward the lessons I'd learned, the warning signs I'd missed, the importance of trusting yourself even when everyone else tells you you're wrong. Sometimes at night, when I can't sleep, I think about the funeral rehearsal. I think about sitting in that back pew, watching them perform grief they didn't feel over a death they were trying to cause. I think about the rage I felt, the betrayal, the icy clarity that came after. And then I think about the life I have now, the one I built from the rubble of their scheme. I think about the people I've helped, the woman who found the courage to report her son's theft because she heard my story, the man who checked his bank statements and discovered his daughter-in-law had been forging checks for months, the couple who set up separate accounts after hearing me speak, protecting themselves just in case. Each of them a small victory against the kind of abuse I'd suffered. I think about the laws I've helped change. Arizona now has stronger penalties for elder financial exploitation. Banks have better training for recognizing abuse. Healthcare providers are required to report suspicious claims. None of it brings back what I lost, but it might save someone else from losing what I did. I think about the dog curled at my feet and the man who'll call tomorrow morning just to hear my voice. I think about my condo with its mountain views and its walls hung with art I chose. I think about the friends coming over for dinner next week, the class I'm taking on watercolor painting, the volunteer shift I have at the agency on Thursday. I think about all of that, and I realize something that would probably enrage Richard and Sarah if they knew. They did me a favor. Not intentionally, not kindly, but they did it anyway. They burned down a life I thought I wanted, and in the ashes I found the life I actually needed. I found myself, the version of me that existed before I became someone's wife and someone's mother and someone's potential murder victim. The version that got lost in 32 years of cooking pot roast and remembering birthdays and forgiving endless small cruelties. The version that had dreams and opinions and the right to take up space in the world. They tried to kill her, but instead they set her free. That version of me is stronger than the woman who walked into that funeral home to rehearse her own death. She's harder in some ways, more careful with her trust, more protective of her boundaries. But she's also freer, more alive, more certain of her own worth. She knows now that needing people and being needed aren't the same thing. She knows that love without respect is just pretty packaging around contempt. She knows that the most dangerous betrayals come from the people who are supposed to protect you, which means the bravest thing you can do is protect yourself. Before I end my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this, something that might save you or someone you love from going through what I did. When I first heard the term elder abuse, I thought it applied to people in nursing homes, people who were elderly in the way we picture it, frail, confused, dependent. I was 55 and healthy. I managed my own life. The term didn't fit my self-image. But here's what I've learned through my advocacy work and research. Elder abuse affects anyone over 50, and you don't have to be physically or mentally impaired to be a victim. In fact, financial exploitation often targets people who are sharp and capable because they have more assets to steal. The National Council on Aging estimates that only 1 in 24 cases of financial abuse gets reported, partly because victims don't recognize what's happening to them, and partly because they're too ashamed to admit it. There are specific warning signs that I missed, but that you shouldn't. If someone in your life is suddenly very interested in your finances, wanting to be added to bank accounts, suggesting changes to your will, taking control of bill paying when you're perfectly capable, pay attention. If they're isolating you from friends and family, even subtly, that's a red flag. If they're creating a narrative that you're declining mentally or physically when you know you're not, that's gaslighting, and it's often a precursor to exploitation. The medical fraud Richard and Sarah committed is more common than you'd think. According to the FBI, healthcare fraud costs Americans billions of dollars every year, and a significant portion of that involves identity theft of older adults. They use your insurance information to bill for services you never received, prescriptions you never took, equipment you never got. Check your explanation of benefits statements. Read them carefully. If you see charges for doctors you didn't visit or treatments you didn't receive, report it immediately. Financial institutions are required by law to report suspected elder abuse, but they can only report what they see. If someone has convinced you to give them power of attorney or access to your accounts, the bank might not recognize the withdrawals as unauthorized. That's why it's crucial to maintain your own separate accounts that no one else can access. I don't care how much you trust them. Trust isn't the point. Protection is. If you're worried about someone you love, look for changes in their financial situation that don't make sense. Sudden inability to pay bills they've always paid. New beneficiaries on accounts or insurance policies. Withdrawals they can't explain or don't remember making. If they seem afraid of someone in their family or reluctant to talk about their finances when they used to be open, those are warning signs. One of the most important things I learned is that emotional manipulation often precedes financial exploitation. They make you feel like you need them. They create situations where you're dependent on their help. They undermine your confidence in your own judgment. By the time the financial abuse starts, you're already conditioned to doubt yourself and trust them. Breaking that conditioning is hard, but recognizing the pattern is the first step. Document everything. I cannot stress this enough. Keep your own records of financial transactions. Save emails and text messages. If someone is making you uncomfortable or you suspect something is wrong, start a journal with dates, times, and descriptions of what happened. This documentation can be crucial if you eventually need to report abuse or defend yourself legally. And here's something that might be hard to hear, but you need to know. The legal system is not always kind to elder abuse victims. Proving financial exploitation can be difficult, especially if the abuser had legitimate access to your accounts. That's why prevention is so much better than trying to recover after the fact. Don't wait until you're in crisis to protect yourself. If you are in crisis, there are resources. Every state has an Adult Protective Services hotline. The National Elder Abuse Hotline is 1-800-677-1116. There are legal aid services that specialize in elder law. There are support groups and counseling services. You are not alone, even though they want you to feel alone. Isolation is a tool of abuse. Connection is a tool of resistance. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. I know it wasn't easy to hear, and it certainly wasn't easy to live through. But if sharing what happened to me helps even one person recognize the warning signs in their own life, if it gives even one victim the courage to seek help, then something good came from something terrible. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your world right now. Are you driving to work in morning traffic or winding down for the night? Are you cooking dinner or folding laundry or walking your dog? Drop your city and time zone in the comments. I read every single one, and it helps me understand who's connecting with these stories. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or understand something you didn't before, I'd appreciate a like. It helps more people find these stories, and maybe those are the people who need to hear them most. The algorithm isn't always kind to difficult truths, so your engagement really matters. And I have to ask, what would you have done in my place? When you found those forged medical claims, when you heard that recording about accelerating timelines, when your brakes failed and you saw your husband check his watch after taking your pulse, what would your next move have been? Would you have confronted them immediately or gathered evidence like I did? Would you have involved the police or handled it privately? Would you have forgiven or fought back? Tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely curious because there's no one right answer to betrayal this deep. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Every week I share stories of resilience, survival, and the complicated, messy, beautiful work of rebuilding your life after it's been torn apart. Some stories have happy endings, some have just endings, but all of them are true, and all of them matter. Before you go, I want to recommend 2 other stories you might find meaningful. The first is about a woman who discovered her sister had been stealing her identity for 15 years. The second is about a man whose adult children tried to have him declared incompetent so they could control his estate. Both stories have elements you might recognize from mine, and both survivors found ways to reclaim their lives and their power. One more thing. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're living with someone who makes you feel crazy or controls your money or isolates you from people who care about you, please reach out for help. You deserve better. You deserve safety. You deserve a life that's yours alone to live. It's never too late to save yourself. Until the next story, take care of your heart. Protect it fiercely. Trust it wisely. And remember that the people who truly love you will never make you doubt your own reality or steal your peace while pretending to care for you. Real love lifts you up.